Good afternoon, or good morning, evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm not so sure you were talking about me. I tend to think myself as less than whatever I said on some of these profiles. And I will be speaking today more provoking our thoughts, and perhaps it's a pity I missed the earlier presentations due to commitments and so on. But I'll be speaking much more about violence of conservation in Africa, which is the title of the book that we put together between myself, Mano Ramutsintela, and Tafadzwa Mshonga, Dr. Mshonga, and Professor Ramutsintela, who is here at UCT, but Dr. Mshonga is at University of Pretoria, but she used to work with us here at University of Cape Town in the Environmental Humanities South Space. In the picture, you can see part of the contracts of what we are going to be talking about. This is one of my favorite sites of research in Zimbabwe's forests, next door to, but they are all protected areas. But it's a very fundamental space in the western part of Zimbabwe, in what is known as Matabele land. But it shows on the bigger picture, you see a conservation area where wildlife roam. It was a creation in the 1960s to make way for a wildlife habitat, and communities were moved out to another part of the forest where they eke out a living in very rudimentary ways of life, as you see in that picture where cattle are drinking from a trough made from wood. Yeah. To water their animals. And these are some of the contrasts that I will be talking about. So in terms of what I'll be doing here, I don't know why this thing, give me a moment to, yeah, okay. So I'll be drawing from this book on the violence of conservation in Africa and focusing much more on the narrative of violence, which defines a form of relations between people and non-humans. And we see in my talk, I hope to raise the issues that are really further continuities in conservation practices by post-colonial states in the underlying conditions. But at the end of my talk, hopefully we'll offer some alternatives on how we can think about conservation differently. So this is what I hope to do today. In terms of a brief history about the book, it emerged out of the Center for Environmental Humanities South, which I'm a part of, which was formed in 2016 to think about environmental issues from a humanities perspective. By humanities, I'm talking social science, creative disciplines, and literary studies. And so a number of students joined us to embark on this journey, one of whom was Tafadzwa Mshonga, who is a co-author in this, co-editor in this book. And we had these several conversations, which then led to writing about these experiences and also getting other contributors into the volume that we put together. Out of the chapters that we put together, the majority of them are from students who were part of that those conversations. I'm sure you've already heard this talk already, but I usually like to start my talk with this picture showing that big animal there, that human being, that big non-human being. And if you're not discerning, is probably what happened to those poor tourists in that small vehicle who couldn't read that this guy is in mast. And it may mean a lot of trouble if you're not careful. I don't know what eventually happened to them. It's a picture I got from the internet many years ago. I hope they lived to tell the story. But this is the kind of animal I would not want to meet when driving out in conserved spaces. But for me, it's a poignant reminder of how we often see, I think Nancy Peluso many years ago in one of the conferences on political ecology, she put this image of Beauty and the Beast at the same time. You often conservation portrays this beautiful picture, wonderful animals, beautiful landscapes, and so on, but not seeing the underlying troubles, which I'm sure Mordecai and Willem already presented about to you earlier. But so this is the focus that we want to present in this talk. And here's a picture again from that western part of Zimbabwe, which I was talking about, where people are still living in this kind of structures. Their ambition is to, yeah, whatever you want to call it, whether we are subscribed to it or not. But from their perspective, they would like to have more permanent structures rather than this more temporary, no matter how we may look at this from a romantic perspective of being much more in tune with the environment and so on, but they would like to build homesteads that are constructed of different materials, but they're unable to do so because it's a protected area from which they are barred from building those kind of structures. And yet, yeah, the same space, you see often white males from elsewhere, largely Europe and the United States or in North America, who come to hunt big game, big fauna, such as elephant in this area, and generate a lot of revenue for the protected areas themselves. And you can see how happy these two folk are from the picture of that site I was talking about. And often we see conservation in this format as beautiful landscapes. This is the Wild Coast on the eastern part of South Africa. In that same space, these animals, domestic animals, are not supposed to be traversing in this part of the protected nature reserve. And these are some of the contrasts where tourists are supposed not to be interacting with domestic animals in that space, but local people are contesting heavily those kind of protected areas. This is the sort of same space. These are the chalets for the tourists who come to that nature reserve on the Wild Coast in Eastern Cape of South Africa. And this is a different picture in North Central Zimbabwe, a protected forest. And there's this sort of neoliberal idea that, these spaces would generate revenue by tourists, descending tourists who would come and visit. And yet, this is one of the sites which is heavily contested by local communities who would like to get rights back to their land and use it differently. And always in conservation, I'm sure Willem and Mordecai already prefaced this to say, what about people? This is a picture in central, western central Kenya, where people are fishing, especially women are fishing from these natural lakes, but it's an activity that they are barred normally from doing in this conservation space. So how do we define conservation? How do we define violence in conservation? We define it as adverse material and non-material consequences of the ideas of nature and conservation, whose contestation necessitates use of overt and covert power by the state and other actors to enforce management and police. This is, I would underline this, and police prescribed relations between people and the environment. This prescription of relations between people and the environment is deeply the ones that we find problematic or leading to very violent outcomes in conservation in terms of this prescription prescription of relations between people and their environment, or humans and non-humans. That's the fundamental core of what we're going to talk about. And so in my talk, I will raise this issue. I don't know why it's up there, but there are 4 conditions that we talk about that lead to violence being a permanent feature of conservation in Africa. 4 conditions that I want to highlight, or that we highlight from the book that I'm talking about. First, it's obviously to do with the hierarchical ordering between humans and non-humans. I'll talk about this in a minute in greater detail. But also one thing that we surface in the book is about the introduction of global environmental agendas on the continent, that most of these environmental agendas are introduced from outside of the continent and do not emerge from itself. But also one of the things that we highlight leading to violence being a feature of conservation in Africa is the inability of states to regain resource sovereignty. Huge issue. Resource sovereignty is a massive issue that I will return to. And fourthly, I'm sure you have heard this ad nauseum already from other speakers, and has been written quite a lot about, but we also point it out, the neoliberalization of conservation. These neoliberal ideas in conservation, which creates problems. So talking first about this hierarchical ordering of relations between humans and non-humans, and there are three aspects that we raise in the book. One is the dehumanization of Black people and indigenous people on the continent. We find that this scepter, the ghost of settler colonialism has never left Africa at all. This is the contention we make, in the sense that Black people and indigenous people continue to be treated in colonial, in ways that mimic coloniality in the way that they are treated. If you look at even emerging writings now, even go further than we go in the book to point to the aspects about policing. It's never policing as such, but it's really about ordering Black people, even in urban areas. Black people are not treated as citizens, as people who are capable of knowing, let alone in people who are in enclaves that tend to be protected areas. That constitutes violence against Black bodies and particularly indigenous groupings. And then secondly, this notion of reserves, setting aside reserves, where game is set aside in reserves, wildlife is set aside, and indigenous or native people are also allocated in spaces that are reserves. And by doing that, it renders populations that you find in those spaces to be treated in specific ways. So it ushers in relations of containment in areas where they are particularly located. This constitutes other forms of violence as well, in the ways in which people and non-humans are treated in setting them aside in specific areas that are reserves. And then thirdly, in this hierarchical ordering of people and non-humans is also related to issues of hunting versus hunted, where there is continuity of hunting people, hunting particularly Black people like animals. I already referred to how Black people are policed and managed. You know, it's more akin to animals than it is to treating them as individuals, as agents, as human agents who deserve to be treated like human beings. So this is deeply problematic, especially around enclaves or territories that are set aside for conservation. This is what is emerging from our findings and things we have grappled with for many years before we even put together this book. Secondly, I alluded to the issue of global green agendas and non-state actors and the other people who interfere with the or external interference. Normally, I pose a question to audience that I'll be dealing with to say, I would be very glad if someone could point out in our experiences from Africa where the ruling party has a manifesto that deals with the environment succinctly. For me, for us, then that creates an opportunity for external actors to drive environmental agendas on the continent. You know, you may call it, oh, we're post-colony, but when it comes to environmental issues on the African continent, most of, nearly all of these environmental agendas are always driven from outside, reflecting interests of powerful actors who often clash with local realities and needs. And global environmental agendas create conditions for these clashes, which may in turn lead to violence, be it overt or covert, subtle or slow, but nonetheless violent forms which prescribe particular relations between people and non-people. And also these non-state actors are powerful drivers of conservation policy in Africa. You know, yeah, I've already alluded to the fact that, ruling parties in Africa, whether they have any environmental policy at all, often these agendas then come in when they get into power and driven by outside interests and funders as well. Now, moving on to the third issue that we raise in the book is about resource sovereignty and the issue of tenure regimes. So, and we talk about resource sovereignty being impinged by two factors, namely the legacy of colonialism and also state hegemony over resources, which are deeply or lead to um, coloniality, in the sense that not just in terms of ideas coming from elsewhere, but also in the way these territories and spaces where natural resources are found of any value. You have people or populations in those spaces being treated as subjects rather than as citizens. And state tends to dominate in terms of, yes, you would say state is about state power, but politically, there's no negotiation or participatory democracy being enshrined in the way resources could be managed with the participation of populations in spaces where you find resources of any value. And at the same time, there is maintenance of these tenure regimes where there's obviously a problematic, not problematic, there's an assumption that in order to manage resources effectively of any value, those resources must be under state control or under some sort of privatized regime, rather than retaining communitarian ways of managing those resources, as you find across many populations in Africa, which becomes a source of violence because it becomes an alien sort of concept of looking at resources in manners that are privatized, given to state control or private actors, rather than being managed through the lens of local populations in spaces where you find those valuable resources. So that idea of maintaining these kind of introduced tenure regimes or property regimes that are alien to Africa constitutes a violent intervention. And then fourthly, the fourth factor or condition that leads to perpetuation of violence in conservation is this notion of neoliberalization of conservation, where we saw, from fortress conservation to community-based management, and moving back again in the last while under the threat of all sorts of crises. So this move back towards fortress conservation in itself leads to fines and fences and not any democratic dispensation as was being envisaged under community-based conservation ideas that were introduced in the 80s and 90s and lost out in the mid 2000s to now. So neoliberal conservation itself did not operate on its own script of win-win or double dividend of economic benefit and resource management. This is the notion that we bring back. A lot of critical scholars to community-based natural resource management raised this issue that economic opportunities are not were not really ushered to offer alternatives for livelihoods for communities living with valuable like wildlife or fauna. So in that sort of space then creates resource politics and power relations that lead to powerful actors profiting elsewhere, in turn leading to coercion and violence. And we saw with the economic crisis post 2008, where the investments were being made in the name of saving conservation or saving nature. So conservation has become an economic activity where states undertake as a matter of life and death rather than, as a way of life, where states themselves should having a lead role. We see much more commodification taking place in the conservation space, and often it's accompanied by coercion and outright forms of violence in that space. So those are the 4 conditions that we talk about the book. But we also conceptualize violence in many ways, and I just highlight a few from the book, not all of them, that emerge from the contributions in the book. And one of the fundamental issues that we raise that lead to violence or conceptualizations of violence in the book is around the notion of the ideology of conservation, which propagates violence, where instead of focusing on human needs and life and this notion of beautiful landscapes, instead of them flourishing side by side with communities, it leads to these landscapes that are protected, that are devoid of participation of populations that are in those spaces. And this ideology also is also often imbued with notions of finance, in which there's competition rather than care. And neither does it endear democracy, in terms of the way these protected areas and management of resources therein are managed. There is no democratic dispensation. Rather, populations are treated as subjects, unlike in spaces in urban areas or elsewhere where you don't find resources of value. And the other point that we raise in the book that I've already alluded to is this ghost of coloniality, this notion of enclosure, separation, privatization, which leads to problems, to the continuance of violence, a notion about superiority versus what people already do and know, an interventionist, this notion that we are saving, which leads to imposition of control and management from outside, often accompanied by force and militarization, as well as criminalization, these terms such as poaching and so on, when people are actually hunting for survival or collecting or harvesting resources for their own health care and well-being. So you see this sort of notion of the ghost of coloniality, of treating populations in these spaces as subjects rather than as people who are capable of knowing. And you would be surprised this is ongoing in the 21st century. You would think that this way, settler colonialisms, rather than modern day states that are supposed to be treating people who have rights and knowledge. And the other aspects we raise in terms of violence is about spatial violence, what some people might consider as green apartheid. We make the point that this notion of spaces, creation of territories or spaces, in itself, it leads to these spaces where there is concentration of particular ways of ruling or governing these spaces in bounded spaces, which has implications for surrounding communities, or adverse implications for surrounding communities in terms of the way they may relate to nature and also amongst themselves. One other issue or the fourth conceptualization is around infrastructure, which we term infrastructure violence. When physical barriers are witnessed around protected areas, such as fences, roads, the types of settlements, it then prescribes relations that are alien or not the way people were living in those kind of spaces. Fences, for example, in South Africa, and I see this also emerging or going elsewhere, being exported to other parts of Africa as well, where protected areas are now being fenced in. Sometimes it can be good in the sense that you keep dangerous animals in, but it prescribes people how they may move in between spaces and cuts them out from benefiting from spaces that they can benefit from in the protected areas. For example, that's where they may be getting, their sustenance, but then that also stops them from doing so. Even issues such as roads, one of the contributions in the book talks about a road that was opened up for the movement of oil between Chad and Cameroon, or the Central African Republic, going through what were indigenous territories, which resulted in, that area being opened up and leading to indigenous populations' ways of life being disrupted by this road. So that infrastructure did not benefit local populations at all. Yeah. So these are some of the ways in which violence then becomes a perpetual condition in populations. Okay. So having said all this, we sort of then propose ways in which where we would like, or we suggest ways in which African states could move to alternatives which are non-violent, which could lead to non-violent alternatives. And one of the three ways in which we suggest in the book is obviously addressing this issue of ideology of conservation, which should, instead of focusing on conservation, it should be ideology about people respecting and recognizing the dignity and rights of African people, all African people, not just those in cities or those that states deem to have rights, but including people around surrounding protected areas. And then secondly, it's also around populations that have natural resources. Instead of treating them as citizens or as being part of reserves, or as subjects rather, but to treat them as citizens with rights and needs as well. One of the issues that was raised as well in relation to the previous dispensation around community-based natural resource management is the need to create economic opportunities for populations living with natural resources. Obviously, they need opportunities for them to make a living. It's really fundamental. And I've already raised the third aspect around resource sovereignty. This is almost mortgaged elsewhere, where from local level to African states themselves, this issue, wherever there are natural resources, the rights and determination and decision making around resources is externally driven. And this needs to be changed in order to give sovereignty to local populations who live with natural resources and states also that have these natural resources that are of value. And fourthly, the issue that we raise in the book is around resource tenure. What rights do populations living with natural resources have? Where you had communitarian way of managing resources or tenure in terms of commons, these are commons still, but they have now been privatized through creation of protected areas where states and other actors have preponderance and domination of decision making. The tenure regimes need to be worked out in ways that provide rights and access to populations living with those kind of resources. And then for us, this is the other fundamental point we make around the ideology of conservation, is managing protected areas through national parks, reserves, which become epicenters of violent conservation, should be reconsidered for being the main and measurable goal of conservation. It obviously limits possibilities when you manage conservation through these enclaves and reserves, because they become epicenters of violent treatment of not just people, but also non-humans existing in those kind of spaces. It limits possibilities of what can be achieved or how those spaces can be managed. So in conclusion, what do we say? We sort of point to the need quite in terms of a non-violent alternative. So we talk of alternatives to violent conservation of as finding new ways of caring for the earth and all living things that do not make violence a necessary tool for conservation. So it's seeking a non-violent turn, which focuses on interrelatedness, amongst humans and non-humans, without compromising rights and well-being of humans or the well-being of non-humans themselves. It also requires fundamental changes to the idea of conservation, the spaces in which conservation takes place, and the practices of governments and financiers of the conservation enterprise. In practice, increasing and expanding conservation areas need not translate into the number and size of national parks, but rather to do so would be to multiply sites of violence. So what we are advocating is the changing practices of states and those who support the conservation enterprise. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.